So welcome to Trauma and Addiction. This is going to be utilizing information from a trauma-focused approach to caregiving. I'm Gordon Gray, your facilitator for the next 12 hours, and we'll look forward to working together and talking about trauma and addiction. And with me are going to be Bruce Banner and the Hulk, joining us on their journey, and we'll talk about their role as we get to that point. So let's move forward and kind of look at what we're going to be doing today and tomorrow. So we're going to start off with talking about an introduction to trauma-informed care. We'll be looking at transformative care 1. We're going to break it into 3 sections. So we're going to understand how trauma changes our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Then transformative care 2, we're going to look at how the threat stress response system works to interact with people and keep them from healing, and how we can regulate that system. In transformative care 3, we're going to look at the 4 essential interventions that people who work with individuals who have been traumatized or have lived with toxic stress need to respond. And then we're also going to look at and do some work on the subjective units of the distress scale, also known as the SUDS, to help us become a little bit more aware of our own body. We're going to take a look at the introduction to adverse childhood experiences, and we'll look at some of the studies nationally and statewide here in Arizona. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the post-traumatic stress disorder criteria and seeing how we can utilize the PTSD checklist for DSM-5 in connection with that, understanding that criteria and using the PCL-5 as a way to determine whether someone meets the criteria for PTSD. And that'll be pretty much our day 1. Day 2, we're going to look at the opioid crisis nationally and locally. We'll do a little bit of work on that, just to kind of, because that's a hot topic, not only here in Arizona, but across the nation. We'll be looking at, once we understand how trauma is created and what it looks like and how we define it, then we're going to look at how do we help people experience growth versus reactivity and mitigation. And then we'll spend some time, a good amount of time, talking about the physiology of addiction in connection with trauma. And then I'll share some information regarding the empowerment and resilience structure developed by Roten and Gentry. And then we'll talk about some ethical considerations when working with trauma and addiction. We'll practice some regulation skills. And then we'll wrap up with resiliency skills for compassion. I'm going to share with you 5 antibodies from Gentry and how you can protect yourself from burnout or vicarious trauma. And that'll be our 2-day objective. Okay, so let's move forward. I want to talk a little bit about what is trauma-informed care. So basically, trauma-informed care is a paradigm shift in terms of how people have been working. So we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Agency. There are 4 R's of trauma-informed care, what needs to be in existence. We're going to look at what is actually what is the thinking that has changed when we talk about trauma-informed care. So we're going to look at what is it and then compare it with what it is not. And then in what ways does our perspective of caregiving change when we adopt trauma-informed care? Then we're going to look at some key principles of trauma-informed care. Again, this is from SAMHSA, of what organizations need to have to be able to say they are practicing trauma-informed care. So let's jump into the 4 R's from SAMHSA. So the first one is to realize the widespread impact of trauma. And those who work in this field of addiction, we pretty much realize the intersectionality of trauma and how this affects people. But what's important as we look at this, it's not just realizing the widespread impact of trauma, but it's understanding the potential paths for recovery. And so Whether you're a counselor, you're a caregiver, you're a BHT, whether you're a housekeeper, you're maintenance involved in an agency that works with people who have trauma or addiction, it's important to realize you are part of the healing process if you practice trauma-informed care when working with individuals who have experienced toxic stress or trauma. Secondly, we're going to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. We're going to spend some time helping ourselves recognize the symptoms of when we've been traumatized or that we have experienced toxic stress, and learn how to regulate ourselves before we can regulate others. So the recognition piece is a pretty important component that we'll work on. So the first R is realize the widespread impact of trauma. Second is to recognize the signs and symptoms. Then we're going to look at an agency that responds to trauma-informed care will fully integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So I like to spend a little time because my role is more of an administrative role. I work in a corporate setting, and so what I do is I go out and I train individuals, and so I hear things from those on the front line who are impacted by toxic stress and trauma. And so one of the things is, if you are a supervisor, an administrator in an agency, is to begin asking the questions in terms of how do we respond and how do we integrate policies, procedures, and practices into our facilities so that we can minimize or mitigate the amount of burnout or vicarious trauma, secondary trauma that our staff experience, so that we don't lose them in the long run and have continuous turnover. So I think it's really important for companies, agencies, facilities to take time to look at how they're responding in terms of policies, procedures, and practices to ensure that we're a trauma-informed facility or agency. Lastly is to actively resist re-traumatization. So when we do things, we think forward a little bit that if I put this into practice, is there any possibility that I might be re-traumatizing someone who's already experienced trauma? And if so, how can we approach things differently? So that basically is looking at the 4 R's. So again, we have to realize the widespread impact of trauma, to recognize the signs and symptoms, to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and lastly, to resist re-traumatization. So let's talk about what does trauma-informed care look like versus what it doesn't look like. So I'm going to put down some things here. There's a couple slides we'll do of this. So the paradigm shift is that trauma-informed care changes the question to what happened to you as opposed to the question, what's wrong with you? So when you think about what's wrong with you as opposed to what happened to you, take a moment to kind of think through, how does that change the way we approach a person when I think to myself, what's happened to you, as opposed to when I think, what's wrong with you? So basically, we're going to look at, when we ask the question, what's wrong with you, we are really kind of assigning some level of blame to that person. Secondly, we're identifying weakness rather than strength. When we look at what's happened to you, it takes away any concept that we're assigning blame to someone. It's non-judgmental. It's really looking for a way to interact with that person in a strength-based approach. And then also, instead of looking at their weaknesses, looking at what are their strengths. Secondly, trauma-informed care encourages self-empowerment. So when we don't use trauma-informed care, we typically take an authoritarian, which is about control, usually using power and force. So we're trying to get people to do what we want them to do rather than encouraging them to make decisions on their own. So typically, let's take, for example, somebody wants to leave your facility who maybe has been there for a short period of time. Typically, what we're going to do is try to use an authoritarian approach, trying to encourage them not to leave, which is a noble thing. We don't want people to leave because we know that they're probably going to go out and use and put themselves in harm's way. So we understand that component. But if we're encouraging self-empowerment, sometimes we have to realize we have to be validating the fact that someone has made a choice. Whether that choice agrees with what we would want for them to do is immaterial. What's important is validating that person that's an awesome thing that you've made a choice for yourself. It's maybe not what I would choose for you, but what I hope is that if you find yourself in trouble, that you'll be able to make the same choice, that maybe you need to come back to our facility and there'll be no questions asked. We'll welcome you with open arms and encourage you to continue using self-empowerment, rather than saying, if you leave, then chances of you getting back in may be thwarted because we're not going to bring you back in because you left in the first place. So we want to get away from controlling people through power and force and encouraging self-empowerment. And my experience has been is when we do that, when people get into trouble and we welcome them back without judgment, they tend to do better and actually have better outcomes. Trauma-informed care also has this component where challenging behaviors are seen as a way to adapt. So it's what we're going to get into down the road. We're going to look at behaviors, and you're going to hear me make this comment, that's perfectly normal biological behavior. And that is a huge change in itself. And sometimes it's difficult for clinicians and other people who work within the addiction world to wrap their heads around. So we're going to just introduce that in terms of we're looking at challenging behaviors are seen as a way to adapt. We're going to clarify that down the road, as opposed to looking at challenging behaviors are intentional and on purpose. So I'm going to challenge you as we go through this, that when people have challenging behaviors, when they're working out of the limbic system, they do not do things intentionally or on purpose. And those are some difficult things for people to actually wrap their heads around, but we're going to go through and look at the science behind that. All right, what else is trauma-informed care? It overlooks the behavior and sees the person, it validates the humanity of the resident, and sees behaviors of symptoms of biology and communication. So trauma-informed care is asking us to overlook the behavior and see the person as opposed to looking at the person as the problem. Many times when we work with individuals, we develop a judgmental attitude or we make assumptions about people and we see them as the problem that rather than looking at them as a person and trying to understand that the behavior is a way for them to communicate that something is going on in their life. Trauma-informed care validates the humanity of the resident as opposed to marginalizing and criticizing the resident. How many of us have worked with someone who's been very difficult and maybe we don't really care for working with them because they create a lot of trouble for us. Maybe they make phone calls to the Department of Health. We have investigations going on. And so we develop this attitude where we marginalize or maybe we criticize the resident. And that can be done sometimes in the break room, in the hallways. When we are just basically talking to staff, we marginalize and criticize the resident, sometimes making fun of the resident, which really does not promote trauma-informed care. So when we work with difficult individuals, it's important to remember I need to be able to validate the humanity of that person. And what helps me is to always go back to that initial question, what's happened to this person? Usually when I find myself or find people marginalizing and criticizing, it's because we've taken that question and we're saying, what's wrong with you? So when we ask the question, what's happened to you, it makes it easier for us to validate the humanity of that person and to show them dignity and respect and compassion. Trauma-informed care sees behaviors as symptoms of biology. They're connected to the biological system and communication. So when people act out, I usually try to explain to people they're trying to communicate to us something. So as an example, I have a niece who's 21. She's nonverbal. She's developmentally delayed. She is visually impaired. And she makes noises. That's how she communicates. And so the job of the family is basically to try to understand, what do these noises represent for her? Does it mean she has a pee-pee pan? Does it mean she's gone poop? Does she need to be changed? Is she hungry? Is she not feeling good? Is she not liking the show she's watching? Is she uncomfortable in some way? So you have to kind of piece together, what is the person trying to communicate? So what I usually challenge people is, when we have challenging behaviors, try not to be a detective and looking for the bad, but become a detective that's looking for understanding. What is this person really trying to communicate to me? Non-trauma informed care sees the behavior as the problem. So we're going to be looking at some of the science that goes behind when people experience toxic stress. And what we're going to introduce to you is that when people are having challenging behaviors, that's really symptomology of biology. That biology is trying to tell us something that's going on with them, that they're adapting or mitigating, in trying to communicate a need that they have. And so we need to understand that if this is perfectly biological behavior, not to be afraid of it, but also to anticipate it and be ready to find ways to intervene with it. Let's look at, we're going to look at 7 components or thoughts, things that we can look at when an organization calls itself trauma-informed. So basically, the first thing is we have to talk about is safety. As an organization, we have to start with staff, and then the people they serve, our customers, our clients, our residents, all need to have the ability to feel physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe. So safety really is one of those components that understands all the 4 things we talked about that SAMHSA says is important, because it integrates so many things. It incorporates staff, it incorporates those that come into contact with our services, and even the families that are affected by this. So it's important for us to be able to look at, from a physical standpoint, emotional, and psychological component, are we creating safety not only for our staff, but for the people we serve and the families that are involved in their services. Secondly is to look at trustworthiness and transparency. So organizations need to operate and make decisions with transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, clients, and family members of those receiving services. So again, I'm going to kind of go back to staff. If you're a supervisor, it's important to the best of your ability to build trust by creating transparency about what's going on with your agency. Now, there are times that you can't share things, but be honest with people. Just say, I'm not at liberty to share that information. But those things that you can share, keep open communication so people aren't surprised. When we talk about trauma, structure is really important. Surprising people is one of those things that tears down trust, tears down rapport when we work with people who have been traumatized. And what we're going to find out is when we look at the ACE studies, most people who work in the helping professions, those who are watching this video, you probably have some level of adversity in your life from your childhood. And what that does, it sets us up to have toxic stress, and that when we get surprised, sometimes it puts us into our limbic system or survival mode and makes us not trust and the places we work. And so what happens are people end up moving on, and we have a lot of turnover because there's a little bit of trustworthiness and transparency that goes on. The same thing is when we work with individuals, is to be trustworthy and transparent. So it's important that, in my life, what I do is when I make a mistake, I've learned to go before the people that I've made that mistake with. If I'm working with people in recovery, in a recovery facility, and I make a mistake, I'll usually have a house meeting, and I'm going to make that known to them that I messed up. I did something that wasn't maybe totally appropriate, or I made a bad decision, and I'm going to do my best not to suck so much the next time and try to do better. But just to be honest and transparent about that. What that does, first of all, it creates trust, creates transparency, but it also helps residents to know that when they make mistakes, that they can take time to be honest, trustworthy, and transparent about their own mistakes, because they see staff doing it, which is really an important life skill that we can teach them. Let's move on to peer support and mutual self-help. I know in Arizona, most of the insurance companies, access, especially if you're an access provider, peer support and mutual self-help is really important. And I've seen the importance of this. So as I've done counseling, there are individuals that I can reach so far. But for example, I was working with a gentleman who had complicated grief. He had PTSD. He had served 4 tours of duty as a medic in Afghanistan. So he saw a lot of horrible things that created post-traumatic stress in his life. And then when he came home after serving, he was home for about a year, and then his wife was murdered. So he had a lot of things going on in his life, and the way that he dealt with that was to go to opiates and became an opiate addict. So as we were working on things and we were addressing his trauma, I could reach certain points, but there were times in his life where he became extremely dysregulated, and whatever skills I had were not enough to help him regulate. But he was part of a system where he had what they call a navigator, which was really a peer support. His peer support specialist or navigator was someone who had served in the military, but it was also in recovery. And so all I would have to do is make a phone call, say, hey, Gabe, can you come by sometime today and talk to so-and-so, because he's really dysregulated and nothing I'm able to work with him on is working. That peer support or navigator would come and meet with him, and it was always amazing to watch how that support system helped that individual learn how to regulate, because they were able to have a communication, a bonding, a connection that I was not able to have with him. And I think a lot of it was the fact that he was part military, and also the fact that he was in recovery. So it's really important as we run programs, we have in the back of our mind that we want to ensure that those who graduate at some point, those who are maintaining the sobriety, that we make them part of a peer support system to come back and talk with our members who are new, and to encourage them and let them know there's hope that you can maintain the sobriety for a long period of time. Same thing with mutual self-help. So if you're working with SMI, it's important that they see people who are also SMI being successful in life, so that it helps them to realize there's hope and they can move forward with their lives. So that's basically peer support and mutual self-help. Number 4 is collaboration and mutuality. This is kind of a no-brainer, but we do have problems in our world, because sometimes we, as facilities, especially in substance abuse, we become very territorial. But with limitations in finances and funding, it's important that we collaborate and we look at ways of finding other agencies, facilities, corporations that can assist us with doing the things we need to do that we may not have the money to be able to do, and finding where we have meaningful and ability to have relationships where we can meet the needs of our clientele, residents, or the people we work with. So it's, as things get tighter and tighter, collaboration and mutuality become really critical in terms of agencies and facilities to be able to sustain themselves. Collaboration and mutuality also could include the aspect of looking at what are our outcomes. You know, if we really want to be, let's just deal with trauma sensitive, do we have collaborations and do we have people who are looking at whether we're meeting the 4 R's, you know, or are we even addressing the 7 things we're going to talk about presently? So it's important to have some accountability through collaboration and mutuality that we're going to address these things to ensure that we are a trauma-sensitive and informed organization. The next one is empowerment, voice, and choice. So this is where we believe in building on the individual's strengths and skills. Trauma-informed care aims to strengthen the staff's, clients, and family members' experience of choice and recognize that every person's experience is unique and requires an individual approach. So let's break this down for just a little bit. So how do we give, let's start with staff. How do we give empowerment and voice and choice to staff? So one of the things we've done in our facilities has been, we do quarterly, what's the word I want here? I just had a memory lapse. We're going to look at satisfaction surveys. So there's a series of questions that staff will be asked to make sure that they are feeling empowered, they have a voice, and they have choice in what's going on in their facility. And so those surveys become one way that they can share what's going on with the corporate office. The other is our owner is very engaged in terms of our facilities, and we'll go out and have house meetings, and we'll ask the residents. Sometimes she'll meet with the staff without their bosses being there and say, what's really happening? I want to hear what's really going on. And so it lets them know that they have an ear that's going to listen to them and gives them the ability to develop that empowerment and choice as the corporate office works with the facility and making that happen. So that's kind of at a staff level. The same thing happens with our clientele. So they get regular, I believe it's quarterly, it's a monthly review, a satisfaction survey, where they're going to be asked questions on things that are going on in terms of programming, their counseling, their experience, and then that's turned into the corporate office every month. And then our owner will go out and she'll hold meetings with the clients without any staff present and kind of ask them very point blank questions about what's going on, and gets pretty good ideas of how we can change what we need to do to make their experience a much better experience. So it's important that we think outside the box and look at ways of building individual strengths and skills and giving people empowerment, voice, and choice. Resiliency. So a trauma-sensitive, informed organization believes in resilience and in the ability of individuals, organizations, and communities to heal and promote recovery from trauma regardless of what has happened. This builds on what clients, staff, and communities have to offer rather than responding to perceived deficits. So it's looking at, many times, let's go from a client perspective. It's understanding and sharing with them, you're the expert in this. You're the one who's been living this, so help us to know, how can we help you to be resilient? What are you doing presently that's gotten you here that is a part of resiliency? Because somehow they've gotten into our facilities. And many times that's not easy because we have waiting lists And when someone is able to do that, who is in the midst of addiction, we have to take a moment to stand back and think, what in the world have they done to be able to get here and not continue using, or get to the point where things are hopeless and they don't want to come into the facility. So we want to build on that resilience. We want to find ways to promote that resilience, to recognize that resilience, and to help them to continue to walk forward with those resiliencies. Trauma-informed care builds on strengths rather than perceived deficits of people. Number 7 is a trauma-sensitive and informed organization is going to look at cultural, historical, and gender issues that have created trauma. So when we talk about cultural trauma, so for those of us here in Arizona, we can talk about Native Americans, and actually it's across the U.S. because it's really built within our whole nation of how we have culturally attacked and traumatized Native Americans and indigenous people historically in our growth as a country. So here in Arizona, we have quite a few tribes, and so if we're going to be trauma sensitive and informed, we have to address not only the cultural trauma, but also the historical trauma that exists with Native Americans. And it's not just Native Americans, it's also people who are African American, people who are Latino. There's just a lot of cultural trauma that has been created, and I'm speaking specifically in Arizona, of how we've treated people and how we continue to treat people. And so we have to be aware of that and have ways that we can approach this that is genuine, that is transparent, and is trustworthy in how we do it. The same thing with historical trauma. When we talk about indigenous people, how have we systematically taken those who are indigenous and taken away their power, and many times we have historically traumatized them over and over and over again. And it's being able to have that honest conversation and then to build into our systems how we were not going to re-traumatize people that have already been traumatized by, historically, by the white man. Lastly, we want to talk about gender issues. This is not only, it's a national issue, but it's also an Arizona issue, and I know it's an issue in other states when we talk about gender issues. So women have typically been marginalized throughout history. We still have, a year back, so when the Me Too movement, there was a lot of people who got behind the Me Too movement and said this is a good thing, but there were a lot of people who marginalized women who were now coming out saying they had been inappropriately approached, touched, things like that. And so there continues to be a disbelief among people when women say these things happened in the past, and now I have the strength to say that it happened. And then people say, well, you should have spoken out at the time because speaking out now kind of marginalizes what you're trying to say. So there's that gender issue or consideration that when people share with us, and we're going to talk about why that is that someone might not at that moment share that information, and then at a later time either recall something that happened or have the strength then to be able to talk about it many years after it's happened. So there's a biological component tied to trauma that speaks to that, and we'll deal with that as we go through our time together. The other is when we talk about gender, is at the forefront is talking about transgender individuals, because transgender individuals are under attack in many aspects in our country, not only from a military standpoint, but also from a state's perspective. And I know that Arizona at one time tried to make it a misdemeanor for someone who identified as transgender to use a bathroom not of their biological development. So we have in our school system, we have issues going on where people who identify as transgender are not being supported in terms of being able to make decisions about which bathroom they need to use based upon how they identify their gender, what their gender is identified as. Then you have individuals, as we are seeing growth happen, that are considered gender nonconforming. And so they face their own difficulties because people are not able to move past the binary when we talk about there are men and there are women. When you look at it, the reality is there's actually a spectrum that people can be from what would be considered all maleness to all femaleness. People have this spectrum that they can fall into. So it's important for us to understand that, to be able to work with people in many different ways. So those are the main ones, but we also need to look at sexual orientation. I bring that up because that is a component that has been under attack systematically in our country and in Arizona when in the counseling profession. So what happens is when you talk about sexual orientation, you actually have two things that are happening. You have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is wanting people who have religious beliefs to be validated, which is important. And then you have people who are identifying that they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, questioning. And so what happens is you have people who are not validating that people can have a different orientation than heterosexual. And so it sets up this component of being discriminated against. And what's happening is this is bleeding over into our field of counseling, whether you're a licensed, social worker, a licensed professional counselor, a marriage and family therapist, or a substance abuse counselor. We have to be aware of addressing that our ethical standards tell us that we cannot discriminate based upon our personal beliefs. And what's happened here in Arizona is that there's actually have been several laws enacted where it undermines our ethical standards by allowing people to opt out to say that if my sincerely held belief is that being gay or being lesbian or bisexual is wrong, I do not have to work with that individual, which is in direct violation of our ethical standards. So we have to be open to talk about those things and how we're going to work through them, how we're going to supervise people who might have those beliefs, and going forward. Because all those things have the ability that we've talked about to re-traumatize individuals. Okay. So let's jump into trauma genesis. How is trauma formed? What is toxic stress? So we're going to talk about how does trauma change our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay. So basically, what I want to do in this section is to clarify the definition of trauma or toxic stress. So you'll hear this being shared interchangeably. We want to talk about, illustrate how trauma or toxic stress is reflective of changes in the brain, the nervous system, and the body, so that it's a biological function. Understand the function of the autonomic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic nervous system. Identify and discuss the biological or physiological symptoms when the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems are in control, and then learn to identify the symptoms of reactive and mitigative adaptation. Okay, so those what we're going to cover in the next few minutes here. So what's the problem with the word trauma? So if I talk to someone who's in the medical field, they're going to define trauma as an insult or wounding to the physical body. So a femur sticking out of my leg for someone who's a nurse or a doctor would be something they would consider trauma. Okay? Well, I would consider that trauma too, but in a different perspective. For those who are attachment focused, failure to provide a secure attachment environment, which increases disorganized attachment and greater vulnerability to adversity, that's how they would define trauma. Someone who's developmentally focused, constant or repeated exposure to adversity throughout youthful developmental growth or periods would be seen as trauma. And those who are psychiatrists or in the mental health profession, a collection of emotional, behavioral, and cognitive symptoms related to a significant event. So we're going to come up with, I'm going to share with you what the definition of trauma from the Arizona Trauma Institute's perspective is in just a little bit. But let's jump through some things first. Let's understand how the state of the body influences behavior, emotions, and thinking. We begin to understand trauma when we view what is labeled as negative emotion, thinking, or behavior as normal body responses to stress. So this is when we talk about the fact that when people have challenging behaviors, when they are aggressive, when they are angry, when they're anxious, these are perfectly normal biological responses to stress, toxic stress, or to trauma. So to understand that and kind of to put this together, let's look at what happens when our body is overstressed, okay? So typically, the traditional types of trauma, it's usually event focused. So it's natural disasters, mass interpersonal violence, domestic fires, motor vehicle accidents, rape and sexual assault, physical assault, partner or family battery, torture, war, child abuse, and exposure not only to emergency workers like first responders or people in emergency rooms, but also individuals who provide counseling to people who have been traumatized, and hearing these stories over and over again. So what's important is to understand the importance of the central nervous system to trauma and to toxic stress. So let's talk about the autonomic nervous system for just a moment. So the autonomic nervous system basically is what it is. It's autonomic. It's automatic. When I was a drug court counselor for juveniles, we would talk about the autonomic nervous system. So we would be specific. We don't have to worry about blinking our eyes. We don't have to worry about breathing. We don't worry about our heart beating, our food digesting. It's all taken care of for us by the autonomic nervous system. And I would usually have one person as we go through this. So there'd be one juvenile would say, "So can I stop breathing?" And I would say, "Well, let's see. So if you hold your breath, will you actually stop breathing?" And he's like, "Yeah, I think I can do that." So what I would usually say is, well, let's experiment. Let's see what happens. So if you play this out, which was always a fun thing to do, there's one of two things that are going to happen with a person if they hold their breath. They're going to hold their breath as long as they can. Then eventually they can't hold it any longer, and the autonomic nervous system is going to kick in, and they're going to go, they're going to take a breath. And I've never had a juvenile who had this question who held their breath ever pass out. They always took the breath because they could not take a breath. How's that for a double negative? The other thing is, if they did pass out, what would happen is their body would get again, they would start to breathe, and then they would come back to life, or not life, but they would come back to consciousness because now they're getting oxygen to their brain. So the autonomic nervous system takes care of all the things that we don't have to worry about taking care of. But there are two systems under the autonomic nervous system that work together to create balance and safety in our life. And so there's the parasympathetic system, the The parasympathetic system is represented, we'll kind of use this. So this is what we call executive functioning. This is found in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. And this brain here has all the tools we need to be able to function and keep our bodies regulated. The purpose of the parasympathetic system is to maintain homeostasis or balance. So we see the balance in our slide here where it's going back and forth, but it wants to maintain a sense of balance in our body. So that's the function of the parasympathetic system. In that system, in this brain, we have things like logic, rationality, impulse control, creativity, the ability to form and to maintain relationships, and a whole variety of other tools that are really important. Critical thinking is in executive functioning. So it's an important part of our brain, and all those tools together help us to function. So the other brain that we're going to talk about is called the sympathetic system. So we have parasympathetic system, which sometimes is called the cool brain. We're going to call it, remember we talked about Bruce Banner, we're going to call it the Bruce Banner brain. It's the brain that is going to create balance in our life, regulation in our life. The other brain is survival based. So this is a reptilian brain. It's the most primitive portion of our brain and is represented here. This brain has a couple of components to it. So clinically, sometimes it's referred to as the limbic system, but it's very survival geared. On this side of the brain, we have what is called fight or flight. On this side of the brain is mitigation or freeze. And we'll talk more specifically of how that works. So when we are in this system, we move into this brain, the sympathetic brain, we are going to develop either, we're going to function out of adaptions, which is fight or flight, or mitigation, which is freeze. And we're going to specifically talk about some of those things in a few minutes here. Behavioral symptoms result from the overuse of the threat-stress response system coupled with the body's effort to heal. So we have another portion of the brain which is kind of a radar looking for danger. And so those two things, along with the sympathetic system, or hot brain, or Hulk brain, if we use a couple different metaphors, those things work together and they cause us to either adapt or mitigate to reactively. Okay? So when we are in the sympathetic system, this is a very interesting thing. From the diaphragm up, everything is stimulated. So my heart is probably going to be activated where it's going to be pumping harder. My breathing is going to increase. I'm probably going to begin sweating. I'm going to become tense. And it's interesting when I talk to people, where do you get tense? Some people say they get tense in their jaws. Other people get tense in their shoulders and their neck, in their arms, and their chest. So these are all areas where people get stimulated when the sympathetic or the hot system or not the Bruce Banner, but the Hulk brain goes into effect and takes control. So we're going to see cold hands and feet. We experience that because the blood is going elsewhere, and people can actually experience headaches because of the increased pressure of the heart working and the blood flow being affected. When we are, everything from the diaphragm below gets suppressed. So the stomach, the pancreas, the kidneys, the small, large intestines, reproductive systems, all those things become suppressed when people are moved into the limbic system or into the hot brain. Now, when we talk about sympathetic dominance, this became really clear to me working in the drug and alcohol field. I would notice that young guys and typically young men who had been homeless, because we worked with men specifically in our facility. But what really concerned me was, as we would look at their medical conditions going on, I was surprised by the number of men who would come in who were in their mid to late 20s, who were on a sliding scale because they had severe diabetes, and their diabetes was not controllable, and so they were on a sliding scale. And so I was asking the question, how is that possible? What is going on? And so when we look and understand the biological impact, if the sympathetic system suppresses everything below the diaphragm, it makes sense to understand that the pancreas cannot function at optimal condition, and so the potential for people to develop diabetes becomes much more real. And that that may or may not have long-term effects on an individual. So hopefully as they heal, we might see that their diabetes gets controlled a little better. The worst case scenario is that it doesn't, and they continue to have, it's going to have problems with their kidneys, their eyes, neuropathy, all those kind of things that come with diabetes. But it began to explain to me how this is possible, that a young person as young as 25, 26, 27 could have diabetes that was uncontrolled, and how it's tied to the sympathetic system. All right. When the balanced system, so we have the autonomic nervous system, which has the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system working together. When it's dysregulated, which means the sympathetic system is in control with survival strategies, what it does, it's at the expense of intentionality, which is a executive functioning or parasympathetic system skill, deliberateness, which is parasympathetic system, and living with integrity. These are all things we would find in the executive functioning or cool brain. So when the balance system is dysregulated, when it's being controlled by the sympathetic system, those things go away. Intentionality, deliberateness, and living with integrity, which is required to facilitate growth, learning, and rest. Let me go back here. So here is the definition of trauma that we utilize. Trauma is the body's reaction to sympathetic system dominance that has occurred continuously or repeatedly, creating changes in the central nervous system. So let's just take a moment to wrap your head around that. Trauma is the body's reaction to sympathetic system dominance that has occurred continuously or repeatedly, creating changes in the central nervous system. So it's a body thing, it's a body reaction, it's a biological reaction to continued, repeated changes in the central nervous system. So let's see how that kind of works, how that works out. So what happens to emotions, thinking, and behaviors when there's a shift in the body? So when someone moves into the limbic system or into the sympathetic system, the survival brain, there's a decrease in intentionality, planning, reason, logic, and the ability to follow through. You know, how many times have we worked with someone in the addiction world and we hear someone say, man, they just can't follow through with anything. You know, how difficult is it to do that? Well, that should be a sign to us that if someone can't follow through, there could be the possibility they're stuck in the limbic system. And we need to be able to assist them with regulating their body so they can move back into the parasympathetic system, which has the ability to do follow through. When the limbic system is relaxed or is calmed, people have an increase in intentionality, their deliberateness, they're able to be planful, reasonable, logical, and the ability to perform on purpose. All those things increase. And we'll talk a little bit more, because being able to see, to compare the limbic system compared with the executive functioning, when someone is exhibiting limbic system behaviors as opposed to behaviors that are signs of regulation, these things become tools for us to document the actual change that is going on in a person's life. It becomes a biological way, a map to show that the brain is changing from one system to the next. Or if it's going from parasympathetic system back to limbic system or vice versa. Being able to understand what we're seeing will tell us which brain we're working with. So what about executive functioning? So let's be a little more specific. So parasympathetic and ventral vagal systems give access to executive functioning, which means bodily regulation and coordination of physiological responses, attuned communications. So attuned communications is a great skill for counselors. We want to be able to be tuned in to what our clients, what our residents, what our patients are saying to us. If we're half listening to someone, they're going to know that. When they know that we are attuned to them, it's going to create that trustworthiness and transparency that's important to develop the rapport for people to share with us things that may be painful or hurtful to them. We have emotional balance and regulation. So it's important that if we're going to do this work, that we ourselves are emotionally balanced and regulated. And so I'll share down the road here, there was an experience that I had where I was dysregulated, and I said some things that were very unprofessional and very harmful to a person, which gave me the opportunity to grow and to utilize regulation skills when I feel my body becoming imbalanced or dysregulated. And so I'll be transparent with you and share that information, but that's coming down the road. Flexibility and response. Again, it's being able to pause before reacting. And I'll be a little more specific about that also forthcoming. Being able to have some sense of fear modulation. Having empathy. Not sympathy, but empathy. Being able to find a way to understand what a person may be going through and help and let them know that we are we're trying our best to understand where they're coming from and what their situation might be. Insight, discernment, and judgment. Moral awareness. Now, I have to tell a story here about moral awareness because when we are in executive functioning, that's where our moral awareness is. When we are in the sympathetic system, there is no moral awareness. And so the example that I give is, let's say that I have over here Zach. Zach is our technician who's videotaping and making sure that everything's going well with the sound. So Zach goes on a cruise, Gordon goes on a cruise. Now we have no idea that we're both on the same cruise. But we're walking around, all of a sudden we run into each other, and I'm going to say, hey, Zach, how's it going? I didn't know you were on this cruise. He goes, I didn't know you were on this cruise. And so we have a conversation, and as the conversation ends, Zach said he's going to go shopping because he wants to buy something for someone that's important to him. And I'm going, well, you go shopping. I'm going down to the pool because I'm a Pisces and I love the water. And so we go our separate ways. I go down to the pool. He goes shopping. And of course, being a very conscious-minded person in parasympathetic system, I'm going to make sure I have my Donald Duck ring on so that I don't drown in the pool in the middle of the ocean. But what happens is our ship sinks, and the only two survivors are me and Zach. And so I've got my Donald Duck ring, which is helping me stay afloat. And out in the distance, I notice it looks like someone is swimming towards me. Now, let's take a second to step back. So I'm going to assume that Zach has a moral awareness in that, again, because I haven't asked him, but I'm going to assume that his moral ground is that murder's wrong. Much like I'm going to tell you that I think murder is wrong. To murder people is not something that I would be doing. So let's go back to the ocean. I've got my ring on. I see someone swimming to me. Here it's Zach. Zach is swimming to me and he's saying, hey, Gordon, can you share your Donald Duck ring with me? Well, I'm in survival mode now. I'm not in parasympathetic system. I'm in the sympathetic system because I'm all about staying alive because I don't know when we're going to be rescued. So my response would be to Zach, no. And if Zach tried to take the ring from me, I simply would take my hand, put it on his head, and dunk him until the bubbles stopped. Or he's going to try to get the ring from me and dunk me down till my bubbles stop, and then he'll take the ring.